Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one today.
Definitely. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, standing in the absolute most sacred, secure building in your entire country.
Right.
And you were surrounded by people who are just completely terrified of an impending world war.
The tension would be just suffocating.
Oh, absolutely. And then you stand up and tell them, the institutions you think will save you are going to fall. Your leadership is lying to you, and we are all going to lose.
Which is quite the icebreaker.
Yeah, not exactly a crowd pleaser. But today, we are looking at the ultimate ancient whistleblower.
We really are.
We are pulling back the layers on the book of Jeremiah, specifically focusing on chapters 26 through 33. We really want to understand exactly how a human being navigates that agonizing space between disaster and hope.
And to really grasp the gravity of what is happening here, we have to look at the geopolitical pressure cooker of the ancient Near East around the end of the 7th century BC.
Right, because you can't just read this in a vacuum.
Exactly. You have to place yourself in Jerusalem, but, erase any serene postcard images you might have of the ancient city.
Like the Sunday school pictures with the calm sheep and everything.
Yeah, get rid of those. This is a city gripped by existential dread. I mean, to the south, you have the declining but still very dangerous power of Egypt.
Still a massive player.
Very much so. And then to the north, you have the terrifying, unstoppable military machine of the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar.
Who was not someone you wanted knocking on your door.
Not at all. And Judah is just this tiny buffer state caught squarely between these two superpowers.
Just totally stuck in the middle.
Right. And the leadership in Jerusalem is, they're corrupt. They are constantly flip-flopping their political alliances, desperately trying to play Egypt and Babylon against each other.
Which never works out well for the little guy.
It really doesn't. And the regular people on the street, they are panicked. They are begging for good news, searching for any voice that will promise them some kind of security.
Which creates the perfect market for comfortable lies, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%.
Because when people are that terrified, they will buy anything that looks like a life raft, even if it's full of holes.
They really will.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because into this absolute chaos steps Jeremiah.
Yeah, he walks right into the center of it.
Right. He is instructed to stand in the court of the temple, which is, the very center of gravity for the entire nation's religious, economic, and political life, and deliver a message.
And it is not a fun message.
No. It's a message that is not only unpopular, it's considered borderline treason.
Which was a capital offense.
Exactly.
Right.
He tells the people who are coming to worship that if they don't radically alter their behavior, this city is going to become a curse, and the temple itself is going to be laid waste, just like Shiloh.
Which is a huge statement.
Right, and for you listening, that name Shiloh might not mean much today. It just sounds like a place.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, it was an explosive trigger word.
Oh, it was a massive provocation.
So why was dropping the Shiloh reference such a monumental deal?
Because it attacked their ultimate psychological defense mechanism.
Okay, how so?
Well, to understand this, you have to understand a concept scholars call Zion theology.
Zion theology.
Right, yeah. Over the centuries, the people of Judah had developed this unbreakable assumption that because God's temple was physically located in their capital city, Jerusalem was just, invincible.
Like it had a magical force field around it.
Exactly like that. It was a theological blank check. They believed God would never, under any circumstances, allow his own house to be destroyed by a pagan empire.
So it was their ultimate security blanket.
Precisely. But Shiloh was the ancient city where the tabernacle, which was, the precursor to the temple, had been located centuries earlier. This was during the time of the Judges.
Right, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was originally kept.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that.
Exactly. And what happened to Shiloh?
It didn't end well.
No, it was utterly destroyed by the Philistines. The Ark was captured. God allowed his own sacred site to be laid waste because the people and the priesthood had become so deeply corrupt.
Oh, wow. So by bringing that up...
Yeah, by standing in the temple courtyard and just saying the word Shiloh, Jeremiah is completely dismantling their Zion theology.
He's bursting their bubble.
He's taking a needle right to it. He is telling them, look, God is not bound to this real estate. This architecture will not save you.
That's powerful.
He's saying God destroyed Shiloh, and he will destroy this multi-billion-dollar complex too if you don't actually change how you are treating each other.
I really want to translate this to how systems work today, because it reminds me of the mindset right before the 2008 financial crisis,
Oh, that's a really good comparison.
where these massive institutions were considered too big to fail.
Right. They thought they were untouchable.
Exactly. The people inside those systems, they develop this arrogant blindness. They think, we are the center of the financial universe. Nothing can touch us.
And they surround themselves with people who reinforce that.
Yeah. And then when an analyst actually looks at the toxic mortgages and says, guys, this whole thing is a house of cards and it's going to collapse, the reaction isn't gratitude.
Definitely not.
No, the reaction is to destroy the analyst, which is exactly what happens to Jeremiah here.
Right. He does not get a polite debate in the courtyard.
Not at all. The priests and the prophets immediately mob him. I mean, they seize him right there in the temple and demand his execution.
And, the speed of their violence is incredibly telling.
How do you mean?
Well, the religious establishment was locked inside this massive echo chamber. They had surrounded themselves with these prophets who acted way more like state-sponsored public relations officers.
Just yes men, basically.
Exactly. These voices assured the elite that the economy was fine, that Egypt would step in and protect them, that Babylon was just a paper tiger.
Selling them the comfortable lie.
Yeah. So when Jeremiah pierces that bubble with an unpopular truth, their instinct isn't to say, hey, let's look at the geopolitical data, or, let's examine our own corruption.
Right. They don't want a board meeting.
No, their instinct is to silence the friction immediately. When an echo chamber is threatened, it doesn't argue logic. It attacks the messenger's right to exist.
Which is terrifying.
It is. They set up a makeshift trial right at the new gate of the temple, accusing him of a capital offense, just for speaking.
But, let me push back on this a bit, or at least ask for a mechanism to tell the difference here.
Sure. What are you thinking?
Because in modern life, whether you're running a company, managing a community, or just dealing with your own family, you will definitely have people who bring you bad news.
Oh, inevitably.
Right. And some of those people are genuine truth tellers who are actually trying to save you.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, some people are just toxic naysayers.
That's very true.
They are chronic complainers who just want to tear things down. So how do you, as a leader or an individual, differentiate between a modern-day Jeremiah and someone who just thrives on negativity?
It's a really fine line.
It is. It feels a bit like, shooting the check engine light on your dashboard because you don't want to deal with the transmission. You shouldn't shoot the light. But what if the sensor is actually just broken and the car is fine?
That is the essential leadership challenge right there. The differential diagnosis, so to speak, comes down to the ultimate objective of the messenger.
The objectives.
Yeah. A toxic naysayer, they critique to destroy. They do it to elevate their own ego or to just foster cynicism. Their message offers absolutely no path forward.
They just want to watch it burn.
Exactly. But if you look at Jeremiah's defense before the princes of Judah, his motive is entirely constructive.
He actually gives them a way out.
He does. He says, in essence, the Lord sent me to speak these words, therefore mend your ways, obey the voice of the Lord, and this disaster will be averted.
Oh, so it's conditional.
Right. His goal isn't destruction, it is restoration. He is warning them of the cliff specifically so they can hit the brakes.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. A true Jeremiah in your life brings hard, painful truth out of a deep, genuine commitment to your ultimate survival and growth.
That makes the application for the listener incredibly clear, I think. It's a really good moment to just audit the people you allow into your inner circle.
Audit your advisors.
Exactly. Do you have a board of advisors, whether that's friends, colleagues, mentors, who are actually brave enough to point out the check engine light?
Or have you carefully curated a room full of people who just tell you how great you are?
Right. Because surrounding yourself with yes men is super comfortable right up until the engine block cracks on the highway at 70 miles an hour.
And we see the literal, life or death stakes of that bravery right here in the text. Jeremiah barely survives this encounter.
It was a close call.
Extremely close. He is saved only because some of the older, wiser princes and elders decide to intervene.
You step in front of the mob.
Yeah, they manage to calm the mob by citing a historical legal precedent. They point out that a century earlier, the prophet Micah delivered a very similar message of doom to King Hezekiah.
Right.
But instead of executing Micah, King Hezekiah actually listened. He changed course, and the disaster was delayed.
This precedent saves him. But, just when you think, okay, great, the system worked, free speech wins, everything's fine, the author drops in this chilling counterexample.
Oh, the story of Uriah.
Yes. This part is wild. Talk about Urijah.
Yeah, the inclusion of Urijah's story is just this brilliant, terrifying reality check.
It really sobers you up.
It does, because Urijah was a contemporary of Jeremiah. He was out there preaching the exact same message about the city's impending doom.
Doing the exact same job.
Right. But when King Jehoiakim heard it and sought to put him to death, Urijah panicked.
Understandably.
Totally understandably. He fled across the border into Egypt. And, the king's reaction here shows the sheer reach of this corrupt echo chamber.
He doesn't just say good riddance.
No. The king doesn't just let him go. He dispatches a specialized extraction team led by a high-ranking official named Elnathan deep into Egyptian territory.
Like an ancient Black Ops team.
Basically, yeah. They hunt Urijah down, they extradite him back to Jerusalem, and the king personally executes him with a sword and then throws his body into a common grave.
The logistics of that alone are just staggering to me.
It's an incredible amount of effort.
It is. Sending an armed extradition team into a foreign rival empire just to kill a guy who said something you didn't like.
It really proves Jeremiah wasn't just being dramatic about his fear. The danger was profound.
But here is the brutal, inescapable reality about echo chambers. Silencing the warning doesn't stop the catastrophe from arriving.
Not at all.
You can execute the whistleblower, you can throw them in a common grave, but the Babylonian army is still marching.
The facts are still the facts.
Right, which brings us to a really fascinating psychological pivot in the text. What happens when the reality you tried so desperately to ignore finally arrives at your doorstep?
And this is where the narrative transitions from verbal warnings to really intense physical street theater.
Street theater, I like that description.
Yeah, because we move into the early years of King Zedekiah's reign. And the geopolitical situation has deteriorated significantly by this point.
Babylon is getting closer.
Well, Babylon has already exerted some dominance, but Judah isn't fully conquered yet. They're still hanging on. So in this desperate bid for independence, King Zedekiah hosts a secretive summit in Jerusalem.
Like a war council.
Exactly. Ambassadors from a coalition of neighboring nations, so we're talking Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon, they've all gathered to plot a coordinated regional military rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar.
They're going to team up and take him down.
That's the plan. And God gives Jeremiah a highly provocative visual directive to interrupt this. He tells him to construct a physical wooden yoke.
Wait, like a literal plow harness?
A literal, heavy, restrictive harness used to strap oxen to a plow. And he tells him to wear it around his own neck.
So he's just walking through the bustling markets of Jerusalem, approaching foreign diplomats and his own king, wearing a massive, humiliating piece of farming equipment.
Yes.
It's absurd. It's an incredibly disruptive visual.
Well, it was designed to be impossible to ignore, and the message attached to the yoke is profoundly countercultural.
What does he tell them?
Jeremiah approaches this coalition of kings and delivers a mandate. He says, "You must submit your necks to the yoke of the king of Babylon. If you surrender and serve him, you will live, and you will be allowed to remain on your own land."
Surrender to survive.
Right. But if you resist and try to fight for your independence, you will be utterly destroyed by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence.
Man, I try to imagine pitching that strategy in a modern boardroom or like a political war room today.
It wouldn't go over well.
Hey everyone, I've run the numbers, and our only path to victory is immediate, unconditional surrender to the hostile entity trying to consume us.
Yeah.
You would be laughed right out of the room.
They'd probably fire you on the spot.
Exactly. Because human nature fiercely, fundamentally resists the idea of yielding. We are biologically and culturally wired to fight back, to defend our autonomy, to never give up.
It's ingrained in us.
The idea that yielding to a terrible circumstance is the right move. It just feels like a moral failure.
It does. And that vulnerability, that absolute refusal to accept a painful reality, that creates the perfect market conditions for false hope.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. People facing a terrible reality are just desperate for a painless alternative. And this is exactly where Hananiah enters the scene.
Right, the competing prophet in chapter 28.
Yes. He confronts Jeremiah publicly, right in the temple courtyard, in front of the priests and all the people.
And Hananiah understands theater just as well as Jeremiah does.
Oh, absolutely. He's a showman.
He doesn't just offer a theological counter-argument. He walks right up to Jeremiah, physically takes the heavy wooden yoke off his neck, and snaps it in half in front of the crowd.
It's a huge dramatic moment.
And then he declares with just absolute authority, "This is what the Lord says. Within 2 full years, I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon, The exiles who were already taken will come home. The stolen temple treasures will be returned. It's over.
He's promising them exactly what they want to hear.
It is a massive, crowd-pleasing mic drop.
It really is. And what Hananiah is weaponizing here is what psychologists today refer to as toxic positivity.
Toxic positivity. I hear that term a lot now.
Yeah, it is the dangerous promise of a quick, painless resolution to a deeply rooted systemic problem.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, the nation of Judah was facing a massive multi-generational consequence for centuries of corruption, injustice, and idolatry.
Right, this wasn't an overnight problem.
Exactly. The Babylonian invasion was the unavoidable resulting crash of their societal choices. But Hananiah steps in and basically says, don't worry, the crash is just a temporary dip. Give it 24 months.
Just hold on for 2 years.
Right. You don't have to surrender, you don't have to examine your behavior, and you certainly don't have to suffer.
It's the ultimate grift. Is someone telling you that you can cure a chronic, systemic illness with a 3-day juice cleanse?
That's a perfect analogy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Hananiah's lie actually sounded significantly more faithful, more patriotic, and more religious than Jeremiah's truth.
Oh, it sounded amazing to them.
Right. Hananiah is preaching victory, liberation, and God's triumph over the foreign oppressor. That preaches well.
It's the blockbuster movie ending.
Exactly. While Jeremiah is preaching submission to a pagan dictator, so I really have to challenge this concept for a second.
Go for it.
How do we translate this concept today without just endorsing fatalism? Like, how do you know when you're supposed to fight against an unjust or terrible situation and when you're supposed to just put the yoke on and surrender?
What's fascinating here is submitting to the yoke of Babylon wasn't fatalism. It was an exercise in radical acceptance.
Radical acceptance.
Yes. Radical acceptance is a psychological concept where you recognize that you are faced with a reality you simply cannot change, and fighting it will only cause more destruction.
Okay.
The Babylonian army was an insurmountable force. Their presence was a fact. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations we did not choose and deeply resent.
Real-world examples.
Well, maybe a company you poured your life into is going bankrupt, a chronic medical diagnosis is confirmed, or a marriage is undeniably over.
And fighting that reality, insisting that a magical turnaround is going to happen tomorrow, or, denying the bankruptcy by taking out even more loans, doesn't change the facts.
No, it just digs the hole deeper.
Right, it just drains the resources you actually need to survive what comes next.
Precisely. And radical acceptance isn't the same as approval. That's a key distinction.
Right, you don't have to like it.
Jeremiah absolutely hated the situation. In fact, when Hananiah prophesied the 2-year deliverance, Jeremiah's initial gut reaction was to say, "Amen, may the Lord do so."
He wanted it to be true.
He genuinely wanted Hananiah to be right. He wanted the pain to be short. But he knew the underlying mechanics of their reality meant the pain was going to be long.
Wow.
Radical acceptance is saying, this is the terrain I am currently standing on. Denying the terrain or fighting a battle I am mathematically guaranteed to lose will only destroy me.
So the yoke was actually a lifeline.
Exactly. By accepting the yoke of Babylon, the people could actually live. They could farm, they could raise their families, they could survive the geopolitical winter. But by rebelling, they guaranteed their own annihilation.
And the text makes the danger of that false optimism brutally clear. Because after Hananiah breaks the wooden yoke, God sends Jeremiah back with a terrifying update.
It's such a heavy response.
It is. He essentially tells Hananiah, you broke a yoke of wood, but I've replaced it with a yoke of iron.
You can't break reality.
No, you cannot snap the laws of reality in half just because you don't like them. Toxic positivity doesn't make the problem go away. It just hardens the consequences from wood to iron.
And the chapter ends with Hananiah dying that very same year. It's a stark validation that reality always wins.
It's a profound warning. But, it leaves the people who actually listen to Jeremiah, the ones who do accept the reality of their defeat, in a very difficult psychological space.
It really does. They're in a tough spot.
Right. Let's say you take the advice. You accept the iron yoke. You acknowledge the reality of your terrible situation, and you find yourself deported, living as a captive in an empire you hate.
In Babylon.
Right. What are the mechanics of actually living your life day to day in that space? Do you just exist in a state of suspended animation waiting to die?
This is where we get to one of my favorite parts of the text.
Chapter 29.
Yes. This brings us to one of the most brilliant, practical blueprints for human resilience ever written, the letter to the exiles in chapter 29.
Let's dive into that.
This letter is an absolute masterpiece of ancient literature because it directly addresses the trauma of displacement.
Set the scene for us.
Okay, so a significant portion of Judah's educated, skilled population has already been marched hundreds of miles across the desert. They've been resettled as refugees in Babylon, primarily along the Chebar Canal.
So they are already gone.
Yes. They are living in what anthropologists call a liminal space, a threshold between what was and what will be.
The waiting room of life.
Exactly. And the false prophets who were deported with them, they are still running the exact same toxic positivity playbook.
They never quit.
No, they don't. They are walking through the refugee camps telling everyone, keep your bags packed, don't settle in, we are going home any day now.
It's a phenomenon anyone who has ever been stuck in a transitional phase knows intimately.
Oh, absolutely.
I always compare it to moving into an apartment you completely loathe.
We've all had one of those.
Right. Maybe it's tiny, maybe it's in a bad neighborhood, but you had to take it for financial reasons. And you tell yourself, I'm only going to be here for 6 months.
So you don't commit to the space.
Exactly. You refuse to unpack your boxes. You don't hang a single picture. You basically live in a cardboard fort of misery because investing any energy into making it a home feels like admitting defeat.
It feels like you're accepting this as your permanent reality.
But then the economy shifts,
Yeah.
or you lose your job and suddenly 3 years have gone by.
Wow. Yeah.
And you realize you have spent 3 years of your one finite, precious life living out of boxes.
That is the exact cognitive dissonance the exiles were trapped in. They were putting their entire existence on hold, waiting for the ideal circumstances to return.
Enter Jeremiah's letter.
Right. Jeremiah sends this letter from Jerusalem to Babylon, and it shatters that paradigm entirely. He tells them with just clinical clarity that captivity is going to last 70 years.
70 years.
70 years. For the vast majority of the adults reading that letter, and then they were going to die in Babylon.
They are never seeing Jerusalem again.
Never. And because of that brutal reality, his command to them is shocking.
What does he say?
He says, build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and father sons and daughters. Multiply there and don't be diminished.
Unpack the boxes.
Unpack the boxes.
Hang the pictures.
Yeah.
Plant the garden. It is an incredibly demanding command to engage the present moment, no matter how undesirable that moment is.
It really is.
He is forcing them to realize that your life does not hit the pause button just because you are in a season of exile.
And he pushes it even further, delivering what might be the most controversial line in his entire ministry.
Okay, let's hear it.
He writes, seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace.
I want us to really pause and look at the mechanics of what he is asking here, because this is heavy.
Very.
He is telling victims of a brutal imperial conquest to pray for the flourishing of the capital city of their conquerors. He is asking them to seek the welfare of the civilization that slaughtered their friends and burned their ancestral homes. How is that not just ultimate pathetic submission?
Well, we have to be very precise here in how we extract this wisdom, especially impartially, without dragging in our own modern political baggage or taking sides on modern equivalents.
Right, let's look at the framework impartially.
Yeah. Jeremiah is not asking the exiles to endorse Babylon's politics.
Okay.
He isn't asking them to adopt the Babylonian religion or to pretend that Nebuchadnezzar is a just or good king.
So what is he asking?
He is giving them a survival framework for contributing to the common good of their immediate environment. The Hebrew word used there is shalom, which translates to peace, but it means far more than just the absence of conflict.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It means flourishing, wholeness, societal welfare. He's basically saying, look, if the irrigation canals in Babylon work, your crops grow. If the Babylonian markets are stable, your family can buy food.
That is a phenomenal insight. It's a shared fate mechanism. You can fundamentally disagree with the leadership of your city, your company, or your country, but if you actively work for its destruction or even just sit back and watch it rot, your own house is going to burn down too.
You're all on the same ship.
Right. We have to work for the common good of our communities, full stop, regardless of whether our preferred faction holds the levers of power.
There is a really powerful parallel here with the Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism.
Oh, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, which emerged centuries later in Greece and Rome. The Stoics argued that you are primarily a citizen of the universe.
A global citizen.
Right. Wherever fate or the gods or circumstances place you, your ethical obligation is to act virtuously and contribute to the specific community you find yourself in.
You don't get to opt out.
You don't get a pass on being a productive, moral human being just because you don't like your zip code or your current boss. Jeremiah is essentially telling the Israelites to be citizens of the world right where God has placed them.
Let's translate this idea of exile for you, the listener, right now.
Yeah, let's bring it home.
You might not be a refugee in an ancient empire, obviously, but the psychological state of exile is a universal human experience.
We all go through it.
Exile is any prolonged season of your life that you did not choose, do not want, and cannot immediately escape.
That covers a lot of ground.
It really does. It could be a job you absolutely despise, but you are locked into because of the salary.
Right.
It could be a long, dark corridor of grief after losing someone you love. It could be a geographic relocation because your spouse got transferred to a city where you know literally no one.
Or a health issue.
Exactly. It could be a chronic illness that permanently restricts your mobility. That is your Babylon. You are in exile.
And the overwhelming temptation in all of those scenarios is to disengage.
Just check out completely.
To become cynical. To scroll through social media looking at the lives you wish you had. Listening to the false prophets who tell you to just hold your breath until things get magically better.
But Jeremiah's letter reaches across 2.5 millennia to tell you, do not put your life on hold.
There is living to be done.
Yes, there is living to be done right here in the middle of Babylon. So here's a practical question for you to reflect on this week. What is one tangible way you can plant a garden in your current undesirable situation?
I love that. Plant a garden.
Right. If you hate your corporate job, can you stop complaining at the water cooler and instead mentor a junior employee who is really struggling?
Or if you were dealing with an illness.
Yeah. If you are dealing with an illness that keeps you at home, how can you unpack your boxes and find a new way to cultivate deep connections with your family from where you are? Thriving in exile isn't about ignoring the pain. It's about refusing to let the pain pause your purpose.
But, to actually do that, to plant a garden in hostile soil, that requires a massive internal shift.
You can't just fake it.
No, you cannot fake that kind of resilience with willpower alone. You can't just grit your teeth, slap a fake smile on your face, and seek the peace of Babylon if your internal landscape is still full of venom, bitterness, and despair.
That'll burn you out in a week.
Exactly. And this brings us to the profound theological shift in the text, where Jeremiah pivots from the external geopolitical crisis to the internal landscape of the human heart.
This transition is staggering to me. We move into what scholars call the Book of Consolation.
Right, covering chapters 30 and 31.
And the tone whiplash is intense. I mean, we've spent chapters dealing with fire, brimstone, yokes of iron, and literal extradition teams, and suddenly we hit some of the most soaring, tender poetry in the ancient world.
It is a remarkable pivot. Amidst all the warnings of the impending siege, what the text calls Jacob's trouble, the author introduces a promise of ultimate, long-term restoration.
It's beautiful.
It is. There is this beautiful declaration where God says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, therefore I have drawn you with loving kindness.
Wow.
It establishes that the exile, the discipline, wasn't an act of cosmic hatred. It was a severe, agonizing intervention aimed at a future hope.
But the absolute core of this section, the mechanism that changes human history, really, is the introduction of the New Covenant.
Yes, this is huge.
This is where we need to dive into the mechanics of ancient law. In chapter 31, God announces that he is going to make a new covenant, specifically noting that it will not be like the old covenant made at Mount Sinai.
That's a crucial detail.
Let's break this down for the listener. What was the architectural flaw of that old covenant? Why did it need replacing?
Well, the Old Covenant was the law given to Moses, famously written on stone tablets.
The 10 Commandments and all that.
Right. It was a comprehensive legal and moral code, but its fundamental limitation was that it was entirely external.
It was outside of them.
Yes, it was a system of compliance imposed from the outside. Do this, don't do that, perform this ritual, pay this restitution. And the history of Israel up to this point had been one long, exhaustive case study proving that external compliance is fragile.
Because you can force behavior through fear, But you can't force desire.
Exactly. People can obey rules out of a sense of duty or out of fear of punishment for a certain amount of time. But if their internal desires, their core values don't align with those rules, the friction eventually becomes too much.
They break.
Right. The stone tablets could be physically shattered, and the laws written on them were constantly broken by the people. The system lacked the power to change the human will.
So the solution isn't just to, chisel a new set of rules onto a harder piece of rock.
No, not at all. The solution proposed here is a total, radical redesign of human morality.
How so?
God declares, "I will put my law in their inward parts, and I will write it in their heart."
Oh, wow.
This is an evolutionary leap in ethical framework. It's moving from external compliance to internal transformation. The values of justice, mercy, and love won't be a checklist you have to force yourself to review every morning. They will become woven into the very fabric of your nature.
So your baseline instincts will actually change.
Exactly. This raises an important question.
Go ahead.
How do we move from obeying rules out of fear or duty to having those values so ingrained in us that they become our nature?
That's the million-dollar question, but I'm going to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because it sounds beautiful. It really does. But practically speaking, a checklist of external rules is actually way easier for most of us to manage.
It's definitely more straightforward.
Tell me exactly what to do, what to wear, how much to donate, and I'll execute the list. It requires very little vulnerability.
That's very true.
You can be a deeply flawed, bitter, arrogant person internally, but as long as you check all the boxes, society calls you a good person. It's much, much harder to have your very desires audited and transformed.
You are hitting on exactly why true internal change is so rare. A checklist is manageable. It is performative.
Right.
But internalizing the law means your character has to align perfectly with your actions. It means you don't refrain from embezzling money just because you are afraid the auditors will catch you.
Right, because of the fear of prison.
Exactly. You refrain because the very idea of taking what belongs to another violates your deeply held internalized love for your neighbor. It moves morality from a state of anxious policing to a state of natural expression.
And tied directly into this internal revolution is a massive paradigm shift regarding personal accountability.
Oh, the sour grapes proverb.
Yes, there is a specific proverb mentioned here that we really need to unpack. The text says, "In those days they will no longer say, 'The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge.'"
It's such a weird phrase to modern ears.
It really is.
Yeah.
Explain the psychology of this sour grapes proverb.
Well, this proverb was incredibly popular among the exiles in Babylon, and it functioned as a highly sophisticated coping mechanism.
Why did they use it?
They were essentially saying, our ancestors, King Manasseh, the previous generations, they were the ones who committed all the idolatry and injustice. They're the ones who ate the sour grapes.
Okay.
And now we, the poor, innocent children, are the ones tasting the bitterness. We are suffering in refugee camps for their mistakes.
Ah, so it was a way of entirely dodging personal responsibility.
Exactly. They were weaponizing their generational trauma.
It's not our fault. It's the system we inherited. And look, we have to acknowledge there is truth to generational impact.
Absolutely.
We absolutely inherit broken economies, environmental crises, and traumatic family patterns from our parents. That is a reality. But what is the author's response to this victim mindset?
The response is a hard, unyielding line on moral agency. God says, everyone will die for his own iniquity. Every man who eats the sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge.
So no more passing the buck.
No. While the text doesn't deny the reality that we inherit difficult circumstances, it utterly rejects the idea that you can use your ancestors' sins as a perpetual excuse for your own current ethical failures.
That's tough.
Under the new covenant, accountability is fiercely, uncomfortably personal. You are responsible for how you respond to the trauma you inherited.
That is a heavy burden. But if you look closely, it is also incredibly liberating.
It gives you your agency back.
Yeah, exactly. It means you are not doomed by your lineage. You are the author of your own moral choices. So let's turn this into a reflection for you, listening right now. Take a moment to examine the architecture of your own life.
Do an internal audit.
Yeah. Where are you operating out of pure, exhausting obligation? Where are you just following the law on stone, at work, in your marriage, or in your community, simply because you fear the social punishment of stopping?
Just checking the boxes.
Right. And conversely, where have you internalized a value so deeply that it brings you genuine joy to act on it? Because the lifelong goal of human maturity is to move as much of your life as possible from the heavy stone tablet into the living tissue of your heart.
That's a great way to put it. But it's vital to recognize that having an internalized hope and a transformed heart isn't just, a private spiritual feeling.
What do you mean?
A transformed heart doesn't mean much if you panic and hoard your resources when the real world starts collapsing.
Yeah.
How do you actually prove you have that internal hope when there are literal battering rams outside your door?
Oh, this leads us to one of the most bizarre and profound actions in the entire book.
Yes, it does.
This brings us to the transaction of the field at Anathoth in chapter 32.
This story is wild.
It really is. Let's set the stage, because the chronological timeline has advanced from the early warnings we talked about. It is now the 10th year of King Zedekiah. We are in the final, agonizing months of Jerusalem's existence.
The end is here.
The Babylonian siege isn't a looming threat anymore. It is an active, suffocating reality. The city is surrounded by massive siege ramps. The supply lines are cut. Starvation and disease are rampant inside the walls.
And Jeremiah's personal situation is equally dire.
Where is he at this point?
He has been locked up in the court of the guard, which is essentially a political prison within the king's palace complex.
Why?
Because King Zedekiah finally got tired of his relentless predictions of defeat. So you have prophet locked in a dungeon in a starving city, entirely surrounded by an invincible enemy army. The end of their world is quite literally days away.
The economy has entirely collapsed.
Right, and silver is basically useless because there is no food to buy anyway.
And in the middle of this apocalyptic nightmare, Jeremiah gets a visitor in prison. His cousin, Hannibal, manages to get to him and says, "Hey, I need to sell my family field in our hometown of Anathoth. You are the next of kin. You have the right of redemption. Do you want to buy it?"
It's such a strange request at that moment.
Now, we need to pause and explain the mechanics of this right of redemption, because it's not just a casual real estate deal. What is the kinsman-redeemer law?
Okay, so in ancient Israelite property law, which is outlined in Leviticus, the land was divided among the tribes and families. Land wasn't just a commodity you flipped for profit like we do today.
It wasn't just an investment property.
No, it was your family's permanent inheritance. It was tied to your identity and your survival. If a family member fell into extreme poverty and had to sell their land to survive, the closest relative, the kinsman redeemer, had a legal and moral obligation to buy that land.
To keep it in the family.
Exactly. Hanamel is broke, he is likely starving because of the siege, and he is trying to liquidate an asset for hard currency.
But from a rational economic perspective, this is absurd.
Completely absurd.
Anathoth is a village just a few miles north of Jerusalem. It is already occupied territory. The Babylonian army is literally camped on it as they speak.
They probably have their tents pitched right on that field.
Exactly. It's like walking into a massive tech company the day they file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, as the liquidators are physically carrying the desks and computers out the front door and demanding to buy shares of their stock at a premium price.
It makes zero financial sense.
Why on earth would Jeremiah agree to this?
Because God specifically commanded him to do it as a prophetic sign. And Jeremiah doesn't just hand over some silver in secret to help his cousin out.
He makes show of it.
He goes through the most rigorous, public, legally binding process possible. He weighs out 17 shekels of silver. He signs the deed, has witnesses sign it, and he actually creates 2 copies of the deed, one sealed and one unsealed.
Which is fascinating. The mechanics of ancient Near Eastern legal documents involved writing the contract on a papyrus or parchment, rolling it up, sealing it with wax or clay, right?
Yeah.
And then writing a summary of the contract on the outside so it could be referenced without breaking the official seal.
Exactly. It was a very formal process. And then he hands these documents to his assistant, Baruch, and gives him a very specific instruction. Put them in an earthen vessel, a clay jar.
Why a clay jar?
Because clay jars were the ancient world's safe deposit boxes. If you wanted to preserve a document from dampness, decay, and insects for centuries, you sealed it in clay.
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It's the exact same mechanism used to preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jeremiah is doing this because he knows this deed is going to be buried in the ground for a long, long time.
Wow.
And as he hands over the jar, he announces to everyone watching in the prison courtyard, the Lord of Armies says, houses and fields and vineyards will yet again be bought in this land.
It is the ultimate defiant flex of hope.
It really is.
He is making a long-term tangible investment at a time of absolute undeniable crisis. He is acting on his belief with material commitment. But, what I love most about this chapter is what happens immediately after the crowd disperses.
Oh, yeah, when he's alone.
Jeremiah isn't some emotionally detached stoic robot. After he goes through this whole public display of buying the field and preaching hope, he goes back to his cell, and he basically has a psychological breakdown.
He really does. The
Right.
text gives us access to his private prayer, and it is a masterpiece of human cognitive dissonance.
Walk us through.
He starts with high praise, acknowledging God's massive power in creating the heavens and the earth, recounting the exodus from Egypt, all the standard theological hits.
Right.
But it quickly devolves into a bewildered complaint. He essentially looks at God and says, "You made the universe. You are all-powerful. But look outside the window. The siege ramps are touching the walls. The city is falling to the sword and famine."
We are all about to die.
Exactly. And in the middle of all this death, you told me to buy a field for silver and call witnesses. I did it, but I have absolutely no idea what you were doing.
I find that deeply comforting, honestly.
Why is that?
Because the guy who literally wrote the book on radical faith, who just made the most courageous real estate purchase in history, is sitting in his room saying, "That made no sense and I am terrified."
Yeah, he's human.
It proves that courage and obedience do not require perfect understanding. You can take the hard, correct action, make the investment, and still be totally confused and scared about how it's going to work out.
And the way God responds to Jeremiah's confusion is really telling.
He doesn't give him roadmap, does he?
No, he doesn't provide a detailed 70-year spreadsheet explaining the geopolitical shifts that will allow the exiles to return. He answers his anxiety with a profound question. "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?"
Wow.
He confirms the brutal reality. Yes, the city will burn. The disaster is not going to be averted, but the future on the other side of the fire is secure.
The fire isn't the end.
Right. Purchasing the field wasn't a magic spell to prevent the invasion. It was a stake driven into the ground declaring that resurrection would follow the destruction.
Let's bring that to the listener right now. How do we make long-term investments in times of crisis? When the systems in your life feel like they are collapsing. Maybe your industry is being upended, your marriage is ending, or you are watching the geopolitical news and feeling absolute despair about the state of the world.
Yeah.
What is your response?
It's easy to just give up.
It is. Do you just sit in the ashes and complain? Or do you make a tangible commitment to the future?
You have to act in defiance of the despair.
Yes. So here is the question you need to answer for yourself. What is your field at Anathoth?
That's a great question.
What tangible investment do you need to make today to prove to yourself that you actually believe tomorrow is worth living for? It might be financial. Maybe you start putting $20 a week into a savings account, even though you are nearly broke, as a defiant claim that you will have a future to spend it on. Maybe it's an investment of time and energy, signing up for a certification class to learn a new skill the day after you get laid off. Or maybe it's the hardest investment of all, an investment of vulnerability.
That's the toughest one.
Committing to 6 months of deep therapy to work on your trauma, even though your heart feels like a war zone, because you refuse to believe your capacity to love is permanently destroyed.
That takes so much courage.
Buying that field requires immense trust. You are signing a deed for a future you cannot currently see.
Which naturally forces us to ask the ultimate question, which
is?
What guarantees do we have that the future will actually hold? When the city is burning, when the visible institutions of your life, the government, the economy, your health are crumbling, what can you actually rely on to guarantee your investment?
And that brings us to the breathtaking conclusion found in chapter 33.
Yeah, the grand finale.
The setting hasn't changed. Jeremiah is still sitting in the prison courtyard. The siege is still raging outside. And God comes to him a second time with an invitation. Call to me and I will answer you and will show you great and difficult things which you don't know.
And what follows is a sweeping, majestic promise of restoration. God promises to bring health and healing to the ruined city. He promises to cleanse their iniquity.
It's a total reversal.
It is. He promises that the sounds of normal, joyful human life, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the bride, will be heard again in the very streets that are currently filled with rubble and the victims of the siege.
But the most crucial part of this chapter isn't just what God promises.
No, it's how he guarantees those promises.
Because he doesn't point to the economy rebounding. He doesn't say, I guarantee this because the Babylonian Empire will eventually overextend its supply lines and collapse.
No, he goes way bigger than that. He anchors his moral and spiritual promises to the physical, observable laws of the universe.
The laws of the universe.
Yeah. He points to what he calls the covenant of the day and night. He tells Jeremiah, "If you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night so that there will not be day and night in their time, then my covenant could also be broken with David, my servant."
Let's synthesize the mechanics of this. He's looking at a man sitting in a dark, damp prison cell, listening to the agonizing thud of battering rams tearing apart his civilization, and he's saying, "Look up at the sky."
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is linking the stability of divine grace to the unbreakable rhythm of the cosmos.
That is profound.
Human history is inherently chaotic. Empires rise and fall. Corrupt systems collapse. Markets crash. Personal tragedies strike with no warning. But the sun still rises. The stars still hold their place in the night sky.
It's the only thing you can count on.
The exact same gravitational forces that hold the planets in orbit are the forces that underpin the moral and spiritual universe.
So what does this all mean? It's about finding absolute certainty in universal constants when your personal circumstances are entirely upside down. When your life is a complete mess, when your echo chambers have shattered and your toxic positivity has failed, the sun still came up this morning. That physical consistency is meant to be a daily, visual reminder of a spiritual reality. The foundational order of things is secure.
And that is the arc we have traversed today. We began by watching a man stand in a temple, delivering a terrifying truth to a corrupt echo chamber that wanted to kill him.
We saw him wear a wooden yoke, challenging the toxic positivity of his peers and urging his people to radically accept a painful reality.
We read his brilliant letter to the exiles, advising them to unpack their boxes, plant gardens, and seek the peace of a city they hated.
Teaching all of us how to thrive in the liminal spaces of our lives.
We explored the internal revolution, the necessary evolution from a fragile checklist of external rules to a new covenant written directly on the human heart, accompanied by fierce personal accountability.
We stood with him in the prison courtyard as he bought a useless, occupied field for 17 shekels of silver, making it a defiant, tangible bet on a future he couldn't see.
And we ended by looking up at the sky, anchoring our hope not in the fragile promises of human institutions, but in the unshakable rhythmic covenant of day and night. As we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
We spend so much of our energy fighting our circumstances, desperately trying to escape the situations and the exiles we didn't choose. But based on the wisdom of Jeremiah, ask yourself this. What if the current exile you are desperately trying to escape is actually the exact soil where your most important garden is meant to grow?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.